I'm Jim Lawler. I was a CIA case officer for 25 years, from 1980 to the year 2005. And I was my primary uh, job was to recruit foreign spies. And in the last two-thirds of my career with the CIA, I focused on stopping weapons of mass destruction programs, primarily nuclear, but also some biological weapons programs. And I found that very gratifying to be able to save sometimes thousands of people's lives around the world. And so we were trying to prevent countries such as Iran or Libya or Syria from getting nuclear weapons or biological weapons. And so that was my specialty. Since 2005, I've been a consultant to the national security community. I've taught a lot of case officers and a lot of FBI special agents the art of human recruitment. And I still do some consulting for commercial companies focusing on insider threat. Well, I mean, I started out as just a GS-11 case officer, operations officer. Those terms are synonymous, operations officer, case officer. And I got different specialties. And, for a while there, I was just trying to recruit any kind of diplomat I could. In fact, there was one funny story where I was in a international Protestant church overseas. And at that church, there was a man from a predominantly Islamic country, but he was a minority Christian. And he would kind of badger me at the coffee fellowship hour with his complaints about how he could work as hard as he could, but he couldn't be promoted again because he was not a Muslim. And then he would say, and my children can't go to the best schools because they're Christians. But I had absolutely no interest in this guy because he was an administrative officer. And I thought, well, my job is to recruit intelligence officers or high ranking diplomats or military officers. But why would I ever want an administrative officer? And so he would bore me with all these stories. And I'd think, this is a waste of my time. I have no need to recruit this guy. Well, after a few months, I saw him coming towards me one Sunday during the coffee hour, and he was limping. And I asked him why in the world he was limping. And he said, "Oh, Jim," he says, "I've got probably 250 boxes stacked in my office. And one of these boxes got dislodged and fell on my foot and just about broke it." And he says, it really hurts." And I said, "Well, why do you have 250 boxes stacked in your office?" He said, "Oh, well, that's because I'm in charge of buying the cryptographic communications equipment for my military, for my intelligence service, and for my government worldwide." And I said, "How would you like to have lunch next Thursday?" And so suddenly, I call this "don't judge a book by its cover," because sometimes people have very innocent sounding titles, administrative officer, but they're doing some very sensitive and delicate work. And here they are, you just don't realize this guy wants to be recruited. There was another case where I was working a couple of diplomats from a certain Asian country. And we have a informal rule that you should really only work one person from one embassy, because otherwise they might start comparing notes as to why Mr. Lawler is so interested in our people. And one guy was about 10, 15 years older than me, and one guy was closer to my age. Well, I thought I would get along better with the younger man, the man closer to my age. And so I basically forgot about the older guy, and I focused on the younger guy. And we got along fine. And I never really pitched him. I didn't see how I could really get anything from him. He did some things for me that he probably shouldn't have done. And maybe if I'd been more sophisticated or more patient, I could have possibly recruited him. But to a large extent, it was a wasted effort. Well, we got within a week or so of our departure from this country, and threw a going away party. And, somebody threw a going away party for me. And I just decided to invite the older man, who I had not seen in almost a year and a half, to this party because he was a nice guy, even though I had not done much with him. And so he and I were out on the balcony sharing a drink and watching the sunset. And the guy looked at me and he says, Jim, let me tell you a story. He said, after World War II, my brother was out swimming in a lake and he got cramps and he started drowning. And there was an American GI who was walking by that lake and he saw my brother drowning and he jumped in and he saved his life. And then the guy said to me, he said, Jim, I'd do anything for America. And I thought, oh gosh, I have wasted 2.5 years going after this other guy when this fellow was there prepared to do whatever I wanted. So, it's just you learn eventually to detect these sensitivities and to realize that it's not always about you. In fact, it's never about you. It's about them. And you don't recruit people when you're talking. You recruit people when you're listening. Well, you're looking for people who are under stress. You don't recruit happy people. I never once recruited a happy person. I'm, looking for someone who I know has access to information that we need. And because otherwise, why would I do this? And then I'm trying to find out, okay, what makes this person tick? What is it about them that I can offer them to convince them to commit espionage? So I'm looking at them to see what's the stress patterns and what is there about this person that that I can somehow get inside their mind and convince them to trust me, basically to transfer the trust from their government to me. And so there's no set formula. Everybody's different. And that's what makes the job fun, is everybody's different. And you're just trying to find out, okay, what is it? How can I appeal to this person to convince them to do this? And sometimes it takes maybe just a few days or a few weeks, a few months. In one case, it took 11 years. That when I first met this one gentleman, he was single and on top of the world and had no real need. We were friends, but I found out, and I can tell you another story about that, how you really can't recruit people just based on friendship. There has to be a real need in somebody's life. And sometimes it's hard to find out what that need is. But over time, just like if you're a rock climber, when you look at a rock, you're looking for that crack pattern, someplace to put your fingers and toes. And so I look at people just like I'm studying the rock as a rock climber. And over time, I'll find out what it is that makes that person tick and what their need is. In the case of the guy that took 11 years, like I say, he didn't need me. He didn't need anything. He loved the friendship. I was genuinely his friend. In fact, I was even best man at his wedding. That's how close I got to him. But there was no discernible stress in his life until a couple of years after he got married. His new wife decided that she did not like living thousands of miles from home, and they'd had a baby, and she just decided to call it quits. And so she took the baby, got a divorce, and flew back to her home country. So suddenly my friend, his personal life was in tatters, very psychologically stressful. To compound matters, he was reassigned back to his home country. And in the years that he had been gone, he discovered to his frustration that his ethnicity was no longer the ruling ethnic party in the country. In fact, they had been replaced by another ethnic group. And he was so frustrated, he wrote me a note and he said, Jim, I could work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. I could do everything perfectly and I'll still never be promoted because I'm not the right ethnic group. And this is so unfair. How can people give allegiance to a country that treats its citizens like this? So in essence, he's saying, recruit me. So I offered to meet him in a country back in Europe. And he had a business trip going that way. He was going to see his child and his ex-wife. And so I met him in a hotel room somewhere. And I took about 30 seconds basically for me to break cover, meaning that I admitted I was not really a State Department officer, but I was a CIA officer. And at first I thanked him for protecting my security if he suspected that I was CIA. And secondly, I said, I'd really like for you to be on my team. And he looked at me and he said, Jim, now you've given me something to believe in. And he went ahead and worked for us for the next several years. And he became very, very pro-American, as you can imagine. He transferred his allegiance from his country to our country to the point where when 9/11 happened and those towers were collapsing in New York City, he became very emotional at his foreign ministry where he worked. And he said it was so emotionally trying on him that his colleagues there were wondering, why are you so wrapped up in this? This is happening in America. It's not here. And he said, what they don't know, Jim, is now I'm on your team. And so he was already emotionally committed to us. The man went on, worked for us for a number more years, and he retired from that service. And now he has a very successful business. And he jokingly says that he wishes he had a picture of me he could put up in the business with a caption that says our founder. So it took 11 years. Other times it takes a lot less time. We're right. I was in an office overseas where there was a lot of high technology from this country. And even though the country itself was certainly not in favor of WMDs, but their high-tech equipment could be used in, say, the Iranian nuclear weapons program or something like that. And so I came to this office in this foreign country, and I decided that it was worth a lot more to go after these WMD targets than it was the traditional things that we had been looking at in this specific country. And so I developed a number of sources that were able to help us out and against the Iranian program, be it nuclear, also their chemical weapons program, things like that. I was fortunate enough to meet people who had access to the information we needed on that. And so we ran a lot of various human operations and technical operations. And then that led to when I came back home in 1994 from overseas, I was running the European Division's Office of Counterproliferation. And in all of the various geographic divisions, counterproliferation offices were melded into the Counterproliferation Division. And I became the guy that looked at the supply side of the equation. There's supply and demand. Basically, the countries in Europe are the suppliers of a lot of the technology, and the countries perhaps in the Near East, like Iran or Libya or other countries, Syria's another one, they're the ones that would be the customers or the demand side of the equation. And we came together in the Counterproliferation Division, and then that's when I started my operation in about the year 1996 against the AQ-Con nuclear weapons network. And that was basically what occupied all of my time until I retired in 2005. And we brought it to a conclusion in the year 2004 when we basically caused the Libyans to disarm and for Colonel Gaddafi to give up all of his nuclear weapons technology. Yeah, well, AQ-Khan, he was a Pakistani scientist who was educated in the Netherlands and at Delft University. And then after he got his PhD in metallurgy, he became a key employee of the Uranium Enrichment Corporation, URENCO. URENCO is a Dutch, German, British consortium, and they basically make high-speed centrifuges for purifying and enriching uranium from just natural uranium up to low-enriched uranium, which you use in peaceful nuclear reactors, just for power, peaceful nuclear power. And so they had developed these ultracentrifuges, which is a process for purifying and enriching the content of the uranium with the fissile isotope of U-235. And he was a smart Pakistani. He had observed India, Pakistan's arch enemy, detonating a nuclear weapon in the early 70s. And the Pakistani government swore, Benazir Bhutto had said that they would eat grass, but they were going to have a nuclear weapon as well. And so Dr. Khan volunteered to basically steal all this technology from URENCO and take it to Pakistan and give Pakistan the ability to produce the fissile material, the material that is the guts of the bomb. And he did so. And after a few years, they renamed Engineering Research Laboratory Khan Research Laboratory. And he basically enabled the Pakistani government to produce its own nuclear weapons. Now, a few years after that, he was not satisfied with just the Pakistani part of the equation. He decided to take proliferation private, and he cut a private deal with Colonel Gaddafi and the Libyans to where he would supply them with a turnkey facility for basically producing highly enriched uranium, which you use in a bomb, as well as giving them weapons designs that he had obtained. And my group, my team, we had been fortunate enough to be in a position to discover this. We were the first ones to discover this outward proliferation from Pakistan. And then we were able to penetrate his organization and bring it down successfully. And then that resulted in the BBC China, which was a ship that had thousands of nuclear weapons components, the largest interdiction of nuclear components in history. That happened in Italy. And then that also led to us calling Colonel Gaddafi's bluff in these negotiations where he said he wanted to give up his WMD, and yet his team was lying to us. And we proved to them that we knew all about it. And that's when they basically folded their cards and allowed us to evacuate all of that sensitive equipment out of Libya and take away their nuclear weapons capability. Now, that was in the year 2004, 2005. And it was only about 7 years later that Colonel Gaddafi's people basically revolted and overthrew him. And a very good friend and analyst once said, you know, Jim, if you and your team hadn't done this, Gaddafi would have had nuclear weapons by that time. Very good chance he would have. And he would have used those nuclear weapons on his own people. And so in essence, he was telling me, he says, you know, you basically saved thousands of people's lives. I mean, you think about, he had a design for one weapon that was equivalent to the same as Little Boy that destroyed Hiroshima and killed 140,000 people. So I call this psychologically righteous work. If you can stop some madman from developing and then using a nuclear weapon, that's a good day's work. So after we had that kind of information, I mean, we had the network penetrated. We knew where all the players were. We knew all the parts. And so then we went to the various key players. For instance, President Musharraf of Pakistan, he was not aware that Dr. Khan was selling all of their nuclear weapons secrets. And so my friend, our director, CIA director, George Tenet, met Musharraf in New York in the autumn of 2004 and basically said that Dr. Khan was betraying him. And Musharraf wanted to kill Khan, and Mr. Tenet said, no, we don't want you to kill him. And so instead, President Musharraf put him under house arrest for the next 5 years. And then we went to every other government that was involved and systematically shut each of those parts down. And some of these people went to jail, and some basically fled. So we basically shut the whole thing down. Well, okay, so Libya gave up the WMD. You know, they watched the invasion of Iraq, and Gaddafi was convinced that it was better to be a friend of the United States than an enemy. Plus, he needed some improvements in his oil field production and things like that. So for once, he did something rational in his life, and that was to normalize relations with the U.S. And our condition was that he gives up his WMD programs. And that's when he said, sure, we'll do that. Unfortunately, his lieutenants, the people under him, they were on the take, and or for some unexplained reason, they wouldn't come clean about their nuclear program. And we knew they had a nuclear program because of the intelligence that my team had obtained. And so finally, we were able to call their bluff on that and tell them that we had taken these containers off the BBC China and that they were filled with hundreds of thousands of components for nuclear equipment. And so that's when they basically folded their cards and admitted it. And then within a few weeks or months, we got all of that equipment out of there. So Libya has no WMD capability now. As far as Pakistan's got a robust program. There's nothing we can do about it. We didn't do anything about it back in the 70s and 80s when possibly it could have been stopped. And so now they have a very robust nuclear weapons program. And of course, India does too. And that's troubling when you have two countries that are nuclear armed that hate each other, and an accident could happen. Maybe nothing intentional, but if an accident happens, then people might draw the wrong conclusions, and there could be actually a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan, and that would be a catastrophe for the world. So I don't know what kind of peaceful resolution there can be.
Can you tell me about both your novels you wrote?
So the first one, as I said earlier, is Living Lies. It's available on Amazon, and it's all about the nuclear weapons program in Iran. It imagines that the White House is eager once again to strike a deal with the Iranians, and the Iranians have a very smart Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps general who convinces his uncle, who is the new Ayatollah, to engage in these negotiations, but to have a secret covert nuclear weapons program as basically an ace in the hole. And so we developed some sources that tell us that this is what's going on, but the Iranians run a double agent at us who convinces the senior levels of the CIA and the White House that in fact the Iranians are being honest, that they have no nuclear weapons program. And so between a CIA officer and an FBI special agent, they developed these legitimate sources inside of the Iranian program. And we learned to our horror that they do, in fact, have a nuclear weapons program. And then things start to get out of hand. And a couple of, at least one of our assets is arrested because of a cyber intrusion. The agency has put some of its sensitive files on a cloud computing company's system, and the systems administrator is recruited essentially in a honey trap, meaning that he's sexually entrapped by a very beautiful Iranian woman. He's gone through a divorce, he's very vulnerable, and he ultimately compromises the cyber defenses of the cloud computing company and allows the Iranians and the Russians to read all of our encrypted classified traffic. And that's when they start rounding up some of our sources. And it comes down to where the CIA officer and his FBI partner have to go towards Iran and rescue our assets. And it stresses my commitment and that commitment of my colleagues to the security of the people that we recruit, because our highest commitment is always, if I recruit you, I'm going to do my damnedest to protect you. And so that's a very big theme in Living Lies. The second novel is called In the Twinkling of an Eye, and it's about a Russian and North Korean conspiracy to develop a very devastating genetic bioweapon for assassination and for genocide. And again, we have an FBI agent who develops a source inside of the Russian program. And he's an interesting guy. The Russian source is a survivor of Chernobyl in 1986. And tragically, through some radiation and radioactive fallout, he had lost an eye as a teenager, and it's replaced with a glass eye, hence the title In the Twinkling of an Eye. And he becomes seduced into this bioweapons program in Moscow, and he is a brilliant genetic scientist, but does not know that there's a bad purpose for the research that they're doing until he basically comes upon it. And then he learns the horrible truth that his father, who had been one of the chief firemen at Chernobyl and who died, did not have to die. And so he's very embittered at the Russian government, and he's very concerned about this bioweapon program that they're developing. And so he's recruited by the FBI special agent. And it's, again, a race to the finish on who's going to get there first, the good guys or the bad guys. So that's my second novel, In the Twinkling of an Eye. They're both available on Amazon.